So Lassie has been traveling with Rowley, right? Or Rowley, and he's been doing some tricks with the other dog, traveling with the wagon and selling the bowls that his brother made, right? Okay, so, and Lassie's continuing to travel with him. Let's see what happens next. The chapter is called A Gallant Heart and a Goodbye. The two men came up along the road where the trees cast down gloom from the moonlight. Well, if you don't like it, Snickers, you know what you can do. The man who spoke was a great, thick-set man. His shoulders bulged under his moleskin jacket. The peaked cap came down over a broad, square-jowled face. The man he addressed was smaller, thin-faced. From the tip of his long nose hung a small crystal which seemed to be ever there, no matter how much he sniffed. "You give me a pain, you does, Snickers, allus grossin'. I lets you be my pal, and lets you travel with me. I fair sees you live on the bloomin' fat of the land, and what do I get for it? Grouse, 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 all the time. You're tired, ye are. Your feet, you're hurt, they do. You're cold, ye are. Why, ye bloomin'... Hey, Buckles, look!" The big man halted his tirade and looked where the other pointed. Through the gloom there was a glimmer of warm light. Buckles wiped the back of his hand slowly over his mouth. He looked about. By the roadside he saw a stout branch of wood. He unclasped his knife and hacked viciously, trimming away the rough ends of limb. Finally he was satisfied. He balanced the cudgel in his hand, and he saw that Snickers had done the same. Not a word had been spoken. Buckles merely motioned with his head, and the two stole silently down the road. 5 minutes later they were lying in a thicket. The smell of burning wood came straight into their faces. "Peddler Palmer the Potter," Snickers whispered, reading the sign on the van. "A bloomin' travelin' walker, that's what." "Hawker," Buckles breathed. "Then he'll have it with him." "That he will, Buckles. They carries it with 'em. Come on, then." Buckles rose and began to stealthily advance. Uh-oh, what do you guys think he's doing? But before he had gone 10 paces, the still night was torn with the deep challenge of a dog, sounding a throaty alarm. "He's got a dog," Snickers panted. "What do I care?" Buckles said. He stepped out boldly now that concealment was gone, and advanced to the place where the fire glowed in the brazier. "Hold your dog, mate. It's all right. We ain't doing nothing," Buckles called. As he came to the fire, Lassie bayed. He motioned at her with his club, but she faded away. Rowley tried to grasp her, but she eluded him, too, and stood at the circle of the fire, growling. Now Toot's shrill yapping rose to add to the din. "Quiet," Rowley said. "Quiet, both ye." The dogs subsided to a rumble. Then Buckles grinned. He heard Snickers standing behind him. "That's good of ye, mate," Buckles went on, in what he meant to be a disarming, friendly tone. "What are ye havin' now, tea? Now ain't that nice? Could you just spare a couple of homeless chaps looking for work, a swallow or two to warm up?" He advanced and smiled. They sound like they're troublemakers. Rowley rose from his seat on a log. Despite Buckles' words, he was not fooled. He had not traveled alone for so many years without learning to read the character, and lack of it, of men that he met in lonesome places. "No, you don't," Buckles shouted. He leaped between Rowley and the van toward which the peddler had been edging. He balanced the cudgel, smiling. Now all pretense was gone. "Come on, where is it?" he said coaxingly. "Because if you're nice and hands it over without any trouble, we won't hurt ye, will we, Snickers?" "No, we won't hurt him." They're trying to rob him. "Of course we won't. But if you want trouble, then, sorry as we are, of course, we'll give it to you. Come on, where is it?" "Why, I'll give it to you," Rowley began. Then he broke off his own words, and with a sudden leap was beside his caravan. Now in his hand rested his own stout stick. He placed his back against the van. He spit on his hands, did not speak, nor did he need to. "So you want it the hard way, do ye?" Buckles breathed. "Well, all right." He lashed out with his weapon. Rowley parried it and slashed backhand in return, catching the big man's knuckles. Buckles roared in anger. "Come on, Snickers, don't just stand there. Get round the other side of him, you bloomin' coward." The two men rushed in together, and Rowley, against the van, tried to keep them beyond the half-circle of his reach. The blows began to fall on his head and shoulders. He was helpless. In despair, he looked at Lassie, now baying beyond the campfire. "Come on, get him," he called. Lassie darted about, then suddenly rushed at the bigger man. He turned and smashed at her with his stick. The blow fell across her shoulder, almost rolling her over. For a second the fight stopped, and the men turned to the dog. They saw her stand, looking at them. In Lassie's mind, there were conflicting impulses, but one rose to the top. Here again were men whose hands meant evil, who could reach out and hurt and give pain. These were hands that would capture and imprison. These were the men to avoid, as she had done so many times before. A dog should slip away and not be seen by them. At that moment, Buckles made a half-step toward Lassie, raising his club. "Go on," he shouted, "before I give you another." Lassie slid away. Then she turned into the underbrush and trotted up the slope into the woods. Buckles turned back to Rowley. "What a dog," he roared. "You see, mate, even your best friend won't stick by her. Ooh, what a bloomin' dog that is. Now, come on. Hand it over, peaceful-like, and we'll let bygones be bygones." Rowley's eyes, which had followed Lassie up into the woods, turned back to the men. He spit on his hands again, and he braced himself. "Come and get it," he said stubbornly. The men crept closer, swinging warily at Rowley. They stepped about cautiously in the firelight, for the peddler was no weakling, and with his back against the van, could keep a semicircle clear before him. As he fought, parrying and replying deftly with his club, the tiny dog, Toots, scurried about, true to her trust, defending her master. It was pitifully little that the tiny dog could do, almost laughable the way she darted about, yapping and shrilling, a little white bundle of energy. Grimly, she dashed in, and at last managed to get her tiny teeth into the ankle of the big attacker. In a second of surprise, Buckles shook the dog loose with a kick of his foot. "You bloomin' little rat," he said. The little dog rushed in again, and Buckles, lifting his great cudgel, smote with all his strength. The small body was knocked, lifeless and broken, into the underbrush. Shouting in mad anger at what he had seen, Rowley charged out, driving the men back with his frenzied onslaught. He swung his club in fury, and seemed as if he would drive the men before him. For a few moments they were swept back, but then Rowley's anger proved his own undoing, for he had left the protection of the van, and was now attacked on both sides. Buckles, aching from the savage blows of the peddler's club, beat down Rowley's guard, and a crushing blow on the shoulder sent the potter to his knees. Trying to rise, he covered his head with his stick and crooked arm. He felt a blow from the rear. Turning, he clutched Snickers and hung on to the man. He would make one enemy shield from the other until his senses cleared. He felt a trickle of warm blood coming down into his left eye and knew that his scalp was badly cut. When Lassie first vanished into the underbrush at the threat of Buckles' club, she trotted away from the fire and automatically headed south. Yet as she went, she no longer felt the peaceful calm that always came when she was making headway in the desired direction. Somehow, something was wrong. She halted in her tracks and looked back. Now, barely visible through the trees was the glow of the fire, and her ears caught plainly the cries of the men and the shrilling of Toots. It was that high yapping that seemed to call her more than anything else, for it was the alarm, a dog crying rage and defiance. Lassie circled, gliding through the brush, and went back. At last she sat on the bank. Toots's cries sounded no more. Lassie could see the men staggering about before their giant shadows. She saw Rowley sink to the ground. There were two opposing forces struggling in Lassie, one to keep away from the men, the other to defend her home. For the van and the campfire were her home in a sense, and this latter force was the older one in her, one that went back to her ancestors. Her shyness of men was a later thing, acquired only in the last few months of her life, and suddenly the older force won. She had never attacked man in her life, and she was not a ferocious breed, yet once the conviction held her, she did not hesitate, nor did she go warily. With a deep, ugly bang that came from her chest, with her hackles raised, she started down the bank. The first that the men about the fire knew of the dog's return was when a furry shape came across the path of light from the fire like a thunderbolt. She sailed through the air, striking Buckles in the chest. The force of the first charge toppled the big man over. Lassie did not stop. She went out of the circle of light, wheeled through the brush, and came back in another direction. She raced past Snickers, still clutched by Rowley, and slashed with her teeth into his leg as she passed. The force of her drive tore her fangs through the flesh, and the night was broken by Snicker's scream of pain. She turned to Buckles again. "So, you're back," he muttered. Confident that she would run as before, he charged at her, but Lassie this time ducked the swinging of the club and raced past, tearing the calf of the man's leg. On she went across the space, circled, and charged back. Each time she went across the clearing, she slashed as the collie does in battle. Each time she reached the shadow of the underbrush, she wheeled and came from a new direction. Shouting his encouragement, Rowley set to with renewed vigor and began belaboring the 2 footpads. He battered them about, driving them around the fire, and the 2 found that no matter where they turned to escape Rowley, there was the tricolor animal that came, always from a new direction, racing out of the darkness, slashing with her keen fangs, and away again before they could strike at her. Sometimes it seemed as though there must be 2 or 3 dogs, for no matter which way the men turned, there was always one charging at them from a new direction. They were helpless against such tactics, and at last, harried and beaten, they attempted to retreat. It was Snickers who went first, not thinking of his companion. He fled in terror from the ghost that inflicted such lance wounds on his legs. He went crashing through the brush in blind panic, and behind him he soon heard another crashing. It was Buckles, running blindly anywhere in any direction as long as it was away from the foe that struck so effectively and could not be struck in return. From the darkness behind him, Snickers could hear a horrible, worrying sound. Then he heard the voice of the peddler. "Come on, come, leave him alone now. Not that he doesn't deserve anything he gets, but I wouldn't have you kill him. Come." Snickers fled on. He was now alone and friendless. He didn't want to meet Buckles, who would be sure to accuse him of desertion in time of need, and he certainly had no more desire to meet the peddler or his dog. Snickers decided that he who traveled alone traveled fastest. He struck off to the west, and back by the campfire, Rowley Palmer crouched beside a small white body. Lassie stood stiff-legged and touched it with her nose. For a long time Rowley crouched, unmoving, his mind crowded with the memories of many days when the little dog was his only companion. At last he rose, went to the van and took out a spade, and he began digging a small grave. Lassie stood by the crossroads in the cold driving rain. She whimpered once and saw the van stop. The man called to her, and she shifted her feet in a sort of dance, but went no nearer. At last she walked back. Come here then, your majesty," he said. She heard the first word and walked to the man, who squatted on his heels on the muddy road. For a long time he patted and fondled her. Then he rose. "Won't you come, then?" he asked. Lassie lifted her head and moved her feet in the dance, but would not follow. "Aye," he said, "perhaps it's best that way. I'd like to go back on with ye, but stock's low and I've got to be getting back to Mark for the winter. And besides, you never fit in with me like Toots did, and you'd be reminding me of her, not that ye haven't been a good dog." Lassie caught the last 2 words and moved her tail in acknowledgement. "You understand a lot, don't ye? Well, forgive me. I thought at first you were a coward, but it's not that. There's something else about thee, my lass, and I'd dearly love to be inside thy mind to know what it is." The collie heard the word lass and barked at it. The peddler shook his head. "Nay, that's the pity of it. Ye can understand some of man's language, but man isn't bright enough to understand thine. And yet it's us that's supposed to be the most intelligent? Eh, dear, but we have had good times going along the road together, didn't we? And now, if it's over, it's over. I'll be lonely, no thee and no Toots. But I always did say if a man doesn't like to be alone, then he shouldn't never pick the job of traveling peddler for himself. It's what I must expect. In another way of looking at it, sometimes I think you didn't come along with me as much as ye let me come along with thee, as long as our roads lay together. And now, well, you'll be off about whatever business it is that you're on." Lassie did not understand these words. All she knew was that the voice of the man who had fed and fondled her was a warm and soothing tone, so she nuzzled his hand. "That's goodbye, eh?" he said. "Well, may luck go with ye then. Off you go." Lassie caught the word go, and she paced to the crossroad and turned away. There she looked back. The man waved. "On you go, then, and good luck," he called. He stood a long time watching the collie that trotted away. The cold afternoon rain beat in his weather-tanned face. He shook his head slowly, as if saying to himself that he would never be able to puzzle it out. Soon the dog was lost from view. Rolly went back to his van silently. He climbed aboard, clucked to Bess, and headed east. Down on another road, Lassie swung long, going south. The rain streamed from her coat, the mud splashed up over her legs. A week later, Rolly's van moved slowly along the road. He did not sing now, nor did he walk beside his moving home, for the air was thick with flying white flakes. Rolly sat on the front seat. A tarpaulin buttoned over his knees, his buttony face bowed against the drive of the storm. The front of him was almost solid white, and before him he could see the steam rising from the flanks of Bess as she plodded vigorously along. "Aye, that's right," Rolly said aloud. "You know we're most home now, and glad I'll be to get there, for it's been a mucky trip back. Not but rain, sleet, rain, and now snow. I stayed out too long on the trip, and that's what I get," Rolly grumbled on. Then suddenly he stopped his lonesome talk. His mind went to the dog that had left him at the crossroads. Well, he said finally, "I'm most home, and as for thee, my friend, there's hoping that whatever ye were seeking, ye found it. Peace, or whatever it was ye were looking for. But, wherever you are, I hope you're snug and warm and dry. Sometimes I wish I'd locked ye in the van and brought ye back with me, but I didn't have the heart to then, for I wanted no dog again after Toots. Perhaps I shall some day, but just now I don't. She were as true as they come, but happen you're being true to someone else. So goodbye to ye, and I hope you're as near home as I am. There we are, Bess. Here come 12 Corners. We'll be home in time for tea with Mark." As Bess plodded more vigorously and the van went toward home for the winter, many miles to the south, Lassie plodded on. Now she was crossing a great high moor where the wind swept through without halt. The windstorm drove from behind her, blowing the hair in sodden wisps forward from her thin flanks. She found it hard to keep going. The snow was getting deeper, and it took more and more strength from her tired muscles to lift her feet clear of the snow at each step. At last she staggered and fell. Coiling up, she began biting the matted ice from her hair between her claws. Again she tried, but the snow was too deep. She began plunging at it like a horse, rearing and leaping forward, but before very long she found herself utterly exhausted. She stood, her head down, the panted breath coming like white steam. She lifted her head and whined, but the snow was still there. She jumped and bucketed again, trying to leap through the drifts. Again she stopped, without power to go further. Then, lifting her head, she gave a long cry, the cry of a dog lost, cold and helpless. It was a long, high call that went out over the wide moor, through the driving snow where the darkness was descending. The snow blanketed all sounds. There was no one for miles on that flat, wild land. Even if there had been someone within a few hundred yards, it is doubtful whether or not he could have heard that snow-muffled cry. At last Lassie sank to the ground. The white expanse of snow softly covered her. Below that white blanket she lay, exhausted but warm. And that is it for today. We only have one long and one short chapter left. We'll see if we can finish it up tomorrow. You guys have a great night.